At 5 o'clock, and thank you for your patience. And this is part of the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series.
Okay. Thanks so much. It's an incredible honor to be here and to be standing where Noam Chomsky spoke recently and remarked about the bittersweet feeling of being here in a lecture series in Howard's name, and knowing how much Howard would have loved to have been here tonight, and knowing how much Howard would have been inspired by seeing the Occupy Boston action and the Occupy actions across the United States and increasingly across the world. I was so inspired when I heard that the series here was named in Howard's memory, and that people had been naming libraries at Occupy encampments around the country after Howard. That's so important, given, I think, really, that Howard taught a whole generation, in fact generations of people, about the importance of learning from history and learning from those who have struggled before us. You know, I came to Howard's work, I think like many people, having no appreciation of history because of how history had been taught in our schools. The history of generals, the history of wars, the history of presidents, a history that glorified chauvinism, that glorified militarism, that glorified xenophobia, and that really was a history designed to encourage passivity, to encourage a sense that history is made by military officials, history is made by presidents. And to come across someone who pointed out that history is made by ordinary people, history is made by working people, history is made through social struggles, gave me a completely different understanding of what it meant to study history, but also to make history. And you today, and people who are taking part of the Occupy movement, are making history. In only one short month, it's remarkable how much this movement has been able to achieve. Just turn on the television networks. You can actually turn on television news and hear a discussion today of issues that actually matter to our lives. This is a huge accomplishment. The debate has been changed. It is possible to talk about the 1% versus the 99%. It is possible to talk now about how the rich keep getting richer and how they're distorting and destroying every institution of our society. It is possible to hear the voices in the mainstream media, even in corporate media, of people like Amy Goodman, of Chris Hedges, of Michael Moore, of Cornel West, and then ordinary people who've never been part of social movements before, but who've identified with and come out and taken part in Occupy struggles, and who are as articulate or more articulate than the other people who have been called on, who have years of experience speaking to these issues, but who feel very viscerally that they want to be part of changing this society, not just in some small, tinkering kind of way, but fundamentally changing the nature of this society. And that, of course, was something that Howard dedicated his entire life to. I had the privilege of working with Howard Zinn on a book called Voices of a People's History of the United States. And thank you. And a film that we made based on that book and based on his People's History of the United States called The People Speak. And in the course of working on that project with Howard over many years, a few things kind of emerged for me as very important themes of Howard's lesson as an activist, his lesson as someone who is committed to and engaged in struggles like this, and sought to advance them, sought to galvanize them, sought to help them go as far as they possibly could. One of the things that I learned in the course of working on that project was that there are these moments in our past that have been kept from us, very consciously kept from us, that are remarkably important in understanding the present. That is, that what people have struggled for in the past, the things that people have said when they've spoken out against injustice and fought for change in the past, can inform and can help guide us and can help make our movements today stronger. That it's not an exercise in going back and looking at history for the sake of understanding history in itself, but it's about better understanding the present and understanding how the future can be different, how the future can be better. And when you do that, when you start looking at those struggles of the past, and there have been brilliant and remarkable struggles in this country, a few themes emerge. One of them is that every movement started out with people who were considered beyond the law, crazy, radical, outrageous, making demands that were unacceptable from the standpoint of established institutions, established political channels. And yet those people were able, through the boldness of their vision, through the clarity of their vision, and through articulating the needs of many, many, many people in the system that were not being addressed, were able to bring about changes that they themselves at one point might not have even imagined possible. That there's these moments in history when people stand up, when people speak up, and they don't necessarily know what the consequences of their actions will be. And it may not be that day, it may not be that week, it may not be that month, but at some point, that becomes the spark. That becomes something that inspires and galvanizes people. Even decades, even centuries later, that can be true. And so what you're doing today is sending a message to people around the world. And we've seen the examples of solidarity from Cairo to Madison, Tunisia, elsewhere, where one group of people standing up, one people taking a courageous stand, one people speaking out against injustice has inspired other people to do the same, has helped other people find their voice, has helped other people articulate what it is that they're fighting for. And that sense of solidarity, that sense of inspiration, is so important to the movements that are taking place right now. Another thing that you find is that people have to form organizations. People have to find ways of getting beyond the individual talents, the individual skills, the individual abilities that we may all have, and finding a stronger, galvanizing presence that comes through numbers, that comes through many, many people coming together, working together in common cause. And that no matter how great particular individuals may have been in history, who we might single out as being articulate, as being bold, as being brave, that they were able to make change by coming together with other people. And that particularly when they could harness and work with the energy of people who took action as a collective who could hurt the establishment where it actually counts, in their pocketbooks, could take action in the workplace, could take action that shut down production, could engage in even things like general strikes. And we hear that in Wednesday, this week, Oakland, there has been a call for a general strike, and I think we should show solidarity with all of those people who are engaged in that action and take part in our own actions on Wednesday. That is a tremendous power that the majority has, that this economy depends on our obedience. This economy depends on our labor. This economy depends on our showing up and producing the profits that 1%, and in fact it's increasingly more and more, the 1/10 of 1% depends on in order to preserve and sustain their undemocratic rule. Another thing that I think you find looking at some of the movements that Howard documents, it's really summed up in what we use as the epigraph to our book, Voices of People's History. And it's something that Frederick Douglass wrote. And Frederick Douglass was a tremendous figure, took part in multiple social movements. Of course, most known for his role in the abolitionist movement. But Frederick Douglass was also one of the most articulate, outspoken opponents against war. Read his essays on the U.S. war against Mexico, and they're some of the most eloquent you will ever read about U.S. empire, U.S. imperialism. And of course, Frederick Douglass also took a very bold stance for the right of women, for working people. He was there for so many issues, and Frederick Douglass wrote a pamphlet And he said this, and perhaps I'll get a word or two wrong, but he said, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And I want to reiterate that. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. It may be a moral struggle, it may be a physical struggle, it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you will find the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them until they resist with either words or force or both. And so much is encapsulated in that statement from Frederick Douglass that I think it's important to draw out a few of the lessons. First of all, that it is through struggle that we achieve change. It's not through voting for this or that representative of the corporate parties that claim to be the representatives of democracy, but are really the representatives of plutocracy in our society. It's not a gift from on high. It's not a gift from benevolent leaders. It is something that we achieve for ourselves through our self-activity, through our own struggles and protests. Secondly, it's not something that comes about through taking part in the normal day-to-day institutions that are set up supposedly to allow us to express ourselves politically, but which actually are designed to silence and marginalize and limit our participation. It comes about things like this. When people go outside of the official channels of politics to take action, to take matters into their own hands, to disrupt the system, to protest, to organize, to make their voices heard in a way that they would not otherwise be. Just in the way that the corporate media now has been forced to cover the issues of this movement by the Occupy actions, not because of training and going to and becoming part of think tanks and getting invited onto the talk shows, but because the Occupy movement has forced these issues onto the agenda through struggle and through protest. Another thing that I think is important in Frederick Douglass's example, and also in Howard's example, is that linkage of issues. That it's been the strength of movements in our country when they've achieved the most, the great periods of greatest social upheaval, where we've achieved the greatest gains in expanding democratic freedoms and rights, have been when people linked struggles, when solidarity meant that people connected the struggle of African Americans, women, immigrants, the poor, the working class, found ways of uniting those struggles, finding the common themes, the common issues. It didn't fight along the issues along the lines of a single issue, but found those things that unified, found those things that united and connected them. And that's been another very inspiring thing about the Occupy movement. It's been how inclusive it has been of so many issues and the connections that are being made. And the connections that are increasingly getting made as more people are welcomed into and become part of this movement. The issue of war is one that I'd like to talk about for a moment. It was so important to Howard. Howard was so dedicated to the idea of abolition of war, and of course had worked for so many years around the current wars. And if you look at today's New York Times, if you had the misfortune of looking at it, you probably saw an article. I'll just briefly pull it out and show it to you. I'll get the headline right. U.S. is planning build-up in Gulf after Iraq exit. Now, this is not particularly surprising. In fact, if we look at the claim that you've heard in the media recently that the U.S. is withdrawing all troops from Iraq, it's simply not true that they're withdrawing all troops. In fact, the very articles, if you read past the headlines that have talked about withdrawal of troops, note that, in fact, the United States has been working to keep thousands of troops in Iraq, that the United States is working with military contractors to keep thousands of military contractors in Iraq, that the United States is working to preserve military installations in Iraq, that the U.S. has in Iraq the largest embassy of any government anywhere in the world, And that, of course, is designed to maintain the presence and the influence and the control of the United States in Iraq. But beyond that, of course, we now see them talking about sending tens of thousands of troops to neighboring countries, creating a new fleet of ships to bring troops to be ready to be deployed, to strike, and to re-intervene, of course. And the United States negotiating with Iraq to be able to have even more troops return to Iraqi soil than the numbers that they've already talked about keeping. And so when people talk about, as we hear so often in the corporate media and the establishment media these days, about deficit cutting, we hear people talking about how we have to have fewer school teachers and teachers' aides. We hear about how we can't afford health care in this country. We hear about roads that are in disrepair. We hear about all of these social services that we supposedly can't afford. And yet, everywhere you look, we see money for the military, money for troops. And one of the very simple demands, in the spirit of Frederick Douglass talking about demands that need to be placed on power, that we need to make in this moment, is to bring all of the troops home and shut down all of the military bases and use that money for the badly needed needs of schools, of jobs, of health care in this country.